you're probably thinking it's a no-brainer that you want to get cyber liability insurance for your business. And whether your agent has suggested it or a client or a vendor has required it, you almost certainly want to get this insurance. But before you entertain the idea, before you go ahead and start shopping for coverage, there are 7 or 8 things you want to do first before you start applying for cyber coverage, because these things will allow you to get better coverage from higher quality carriers and get lower prices, because cyber liability insurance is not just a automatic thing. You can't just say I want to get it and every company in the world is going to give it to you. It's not like car insurance, homeowners insurance. You have to get approved for it, and there are huge variations in the different carriers. Some carriers provide very extensive and deep coverage. Some are just very basic coverage, and that depends upon how you present yourself to this carrier as a potential risk. There are a half a dozen things you can do, very simple things, that you get your house in order before you apply for coverage. It's almost like applying for a job. You want to get your resume in order, you want to put on a good suit and tie, because I can guarantee you that your insurance carrier that you end up with is going to look very favorably upon your business if you have these things done. So even if you already used antivirus and other cyber protocols, you're not immune to the threats. That's why you want to get insurance. The risk management plan for your insurance coverage is dedicated to the idea of getting these under control. So step 1 is deciding how much risk you are willing to take on in your business. Do you want to have your insurance cover all the risk or most of it, or do you want to retain some for yourself? What is your vulnerability? Are you in a business where if your cyber assets are shut down, you're completely out of business? If your cyber assets are breached, do you actually go backwards? Do you have liability beyond just losing sales? It's impossible to have 100% protection from threats, but you need to prioritize what you are covered for and what you aren't. So sit down with your key staff, maybe executives, your IT people, your managers, and find out what risk tolerance you have, how much of the risk you want to outsource to an insurance company, and prioritize what your investments are. What are your cyber assets? Is it your servers, your data, your customer list, your intellectual property? And look at the areas that have the biggest effect on your business continuity and your profitability. That's step 1. That's pretty easy. You could have a half an hour meeting and come up with that. Number 2 is look at what your current risk assessment is. Where are your vulnerabilities? Where you think they are. Now, this is not going to be the end result of your risk assessment. Once you determine your risk profile, your insurer and other people will modify that and find that you may have more risks in other areas and less risk in areas you think. But it's important to start with a profile, because it'll show your underwriter that you at least have evaluated things and you'll be able to answer questions. If you go into an insurance underwriting process with a lot of I don't knows, that's not going to look good and you're not going to get good coverage. So look at what your current risks are, where you think you have risk. Are your firewalls closed? Do you have all your routers secured? Are you connecting to any outside third-party vendor software? CRMs is a good example. Management systems, for your customers. Maybe vendors connect to your data to upload pricing information, maybe shipping information. So determining what those different connections are and what the values are. As an example, are you giving connections to customers? Maybe you have a car dealership and you're giving out Wi-Fi to your customers, but can they access your server? You may also look at remote operations. During the pandemic, you probably had to do more remote work with employees, with managers. What are their protocols? How are they logging in? You can determine this with IP addresses, data, and device management on their end. They don't have to buy all new routers or Wi-Fi connections or modems, But at least if you know what's there, you'll know how to protect that, maybe with the VPN. Next thing is to understand the data governance. Where is your data? Who's holding your customer list? Who's holding your documents? Who's holding your accounts receivable? Who's holding all the valuable data that you have that you need to access on an everyday basis? Your websites. Is it in the cloud? Is it on a server? Is there a third-party network? Is there an IT company that's managing your website, hosting your website? Where's your customer information? Who has access to it? If it's housed off-site, anybody who has access to it has access to your customers, and you may have liability beyond just not doing business. In many states, almost every state now, if you have a data breach where customer information is released, you are liable for notifying customers, doing credit repair, fixing any losses they have. So you want to make sure you understand where that is. Credit card information, payment information. If you have accounts receivable and you're collecting checks from vendors, the copies of those checks with account numbers on it, that's a piece of data you want to know where it's collected, where it's stored. Make sure that you have all that, because it would be impossible for you to put the correct controls and coverage on insurance if you don't understand where the data currently is. Next is pretend and model a zero trust security model, meaning that every place where there's data connections, technical connections, shared access to your customer list, pretend like you don't trust the other party. You have to at some point, but just pretend that everybody that has access to your data is a hacker. How would that change your connections? Maybe it's that the frontline worker who needs to get access to a customer's information to talk to them on the phone doesn't need full access to the server to get all of your pricing information, to get all of your vendor information. Maybe they don't need to access 1,000 customers, maybe only one at a time. Maybe you can change the access to where they can only access one at a time, so they can't download the entire customer list, either intentionally or accidentally. We've worked on many cases in our private investigative side of our business where an employee was approached by a competitor that says, look, I'll give you $1,000 if you email me your entire customer list, or $2,000. And so now that competitor can access your customers. Not only that, but even customers they don't successfully sell, they're going to be upset with you for releasing their personal information. So you want to check with all your connections, your accountant, your outside salespeople, any CMS you have. I mean, example, Salesforce. Not anything against Salesforce, but Salesforce, if you use them for a CRM, has access to all your data. They have good protocols, but make sure you understand every third-party connection that's connecting to you, and just pretend for a moment that you don't trust them. You think they're a hacker. If that's the case, how would you restrict their data? How would you restrict their access? Can they change data or just read it? Can they delete data? Those are features of that connection you might want to consider. So a zero trust model is a place to start. And then the third thing is, how do you update your software? If you're using different software, even Zoom for communications, if you connect with Zoom, you'll get a notice in your email that they're getting access to certain things, like your calendar, like maybe your camera. Does Zoom need access to your calendar? They probably do, because they put a new calendar notice anytime you book a meeting, but be aware that that calendar information now has a connection outside of your four walls. So if for some reason you're putting sensitive information on your calendar, it's possible that it can be accessed externally. Zoom wouldn't intentionally, obviously, steal your information, but what if they get hacked? What if an employee in that company becomes compromised and a competitor goes to the employee and says, look, we know that XYZ Corporation uses Zoom. Can you get us access to their calendar? We want to know who they're meeting with. Just pretend you don't trust anybody for the moment. So that will help you identify possible breaches, possible vulnerabilities, in your software. Make sure when you're updating it, you know what that update does. Does it create new connections? Maybe you have a connection to a software package, and when you update it to 2022 version, it now connects to a new part of your company that it didn't used to connect to. Even if it's a small update, sometimes an update will change the way that it connects to your company. Make notes of all this. Make a little worksheet of all these connections, all these updates, all these upgrades, all these vulnerabilities, because later when you talk to your carrier, you can now have an outline to show them what the model of your company is. Next one is now write a plan of what you think should be for your data security. Now that you see all the pieces of the puzzle, you see the big picture, what people in your company, what vendors outside your company have access to your records, you can draw a little map of here's what we're going to do. Here's our policies. Who's responsible for enforcing the policies? Who's responsible for monitoring access? One of the procedures that we interacted with in a government agency, it was a law enforcement agency that had a problem with police officers accessing data to look up private information for personal reasons. Like a police officer can run a background check and they can run a search on a person if they pull somebody over to see what kind of record they have, what their address is, their license, their insurance. And certain police officers and other administrative people in that agency were running these checks on maybe an old girlfriend or an old college roommate or somebody to find out information that had nothing to do with their law enforcement capacity. Well, the only reason they got away with it is because nobody was ever checking. So, as part of your policy, put a person in charge of auditing accesses of records. And it doesn't have to be a manual look at every record. It could be a subjective, maybe random check, maybe one out of every 100 searches you look at, and how did that search happen? Who did it and for what reason? And you can ask the person why they did the search, why they accessed this record. You can ask your phone customer support, why did you look up this price? Now, you want to do that in a way that's not accusatory. You want to do that in a way that follows good legal guidelines. You might want to get legal advice from your corporate counsel so you don't do it the wrong way. But you also want to do it in a way that even if there's not a security vulnerability, understanding how your employees use data could help you with business development, with customer service, with cutting costs. So if you have a good picture of how each piece of data is being used, you can use it for security, but also for other reasons. If you have an HR person, they might want to get involved to understand how people are using data internally. In fact, this written plan for who uses data in some parts of the country is required by law. Sometimes it's required by contracts you may have with third parties. In most states, if you're a company that stores or transfers personal information, you have to have a written policy to keep that in place. You should use that same type of strategy for all your data, because if the government thinks it's important for you to keep Joe Schmo's address and date of birth private, you probably should look at it to keep your own copyright data, your employee identification number, your bank account information, your accounts receivable, your customer list, your vendor list. You should look at it as the same level of importance and have a written plan of how you keep that. If you have a written plan and you follow it, that might be also a good way to avoid liability later on. If there is a problem and you get sued or have losses, you can say, look, we had a plan. This happened outside of the plan. Having that plan is a critical step in protecting the business, but also in getting insurance coverage. The first thing that your agent or broker or insurer or underwriter is going to ask you is, what is your written plan for data security and data governance? If you are not quite at the point of buying coverage or that advanced, you can do this yourself. If you want to make that plan even more robust, you can maybe get third-party outside help. The FCC has a tool that you can use to help small businesses write that custom plan, and there are other free tools. What we recommend doing is start by writing your own plan and presenting it to the insurance company and asking them, what do you think about this plan? Do you have any upgrades, suggestions? Because your insurer will be your best resource because they've seen it all. They've seen all the losses, all the damage, all the insurance claims, so they know what you'd want to add to your plan. So it may not be necessary to go outside at first. Run it by your insurance broker at first. Then, once you've done that, and you've either placed cyber liability insurance or you're in the process of doing it, make sure that you talk to all your employees, either in a general meeting or in department meetings, depending on the size of your company, and let them know what all the vulnerabilities are within your company and what role they have in cybersecurity. Just like you'd want an employee to tell you if they saw somebody breaking in a window, you'd want them to tell you if they saw some improper data being exported, if some unusual server activity. Maybe if they saw something physical like a phishing attempt through LinkedIn. Another lower tech method of hacking is there have been hackers that have been known to take little SD cards or small computer chips and drop them in a parking lot of a business, hoping one employee takes it and plugs it into their computer that allows access outside. So let them know what the vulnerabilities are, what to watch out for, what to be aware of. If you're a company that sends wire transfers, make sure that every employee knows how to initiate it and how not to fall for a fake request for a wire transfer. In fact, any wire transfer over a certain amount, you should have your bank have a policy in place where two people have to sign on it. Either way, communicating your policies with all the appropriate staff, and really all staff, and then testing it occasionally will be a good way to keep the employees up to date, keep all the managers up to date on what the threats are. For example, you might want to tell employees, look, we're going to test out some of our procedures, so be aware that you might see something, and determine if the employees notice the test that you do. Make sure you get legal advice on how to do pen tests so that you're not doing something incorrectly. In the same way that you have fire drills and evacuation procedures posted on your wall and first aid kits and all these normal daily operating procedures, you want to make cyber liability and cybersecurity a normal everyday policy. If you have a policy on who gets to drive a forklift, where you keep the keys for the equipment, who's allowed to access the safe or the cooler or whatever, you want to make sure that cybersecurity is just as important and regimented and regulated as part of your business operating workflow. It may take a while to make it natural, to make it an ongoing thing. Maybe you need checklists, maybe you need somebody to oversee it. But once it gets to the point where it's a normal course of action, it won't be unnatural. And you might need some training to do that. You might need some training to get employees up to date. And structure the training so make sure it's very specific and they read back to you what they understand. Once you've done that, hopefully at that point, you're able to place a good quality cyber liability insurance policy and not just have to take an off-the-shelf, run-of-the-mill, poor coverage policy. After that, continue to implement these cyber liability procedures. Monitor the results, always improve them, look for new vulnerabilities, and continue to upgrade them, because guess what? In a year, when your insurance X date comes due, you're going to have to go through this again. What's your policy? What did you change? What did you update? Because between now and a year from now, when your policy renews, there will be new types of cyber liability risk. 4 years ago, nobody ever heard of ransomware. Now that's the most common risk. 5 years from now, there may be new risk, and you being aware of those. So when your insurance agent or your underwriter comes to you and says, hey, we're updating your policy, we're renewing it, what does your manual say now for cyber protection? Do you have this policy in place to protect against this new risk? Your insurance broker or your underwriter will help you learn about those risks, hopefully proactively. Throughout the year, they will be in contact with you. If they don't, you should contact them maybe once a quarter and ask them, hey, is there anything new that you can tell us about cybersecurity? It's pretty easy to do, and in most cases, the procedures you put in place for cybersecurity, not only will they not be too hard, they won't take hours of labor. It'll be pretty simple. In many cases, you will reap benefits from them in your everyday business operation. You'll make more profit from sales and less expense in cost. Because most things that you do for cyber liability also benefit the regular business operation. And by doing that, you also protect your business investment. Look, your business has an intrinsic value, a blue sky value, whatever you've built it into over the years. A single catastrophic cyber liability event can make that value zero, and you'd lose everything you built that business up to be done. Cyber liability insurance is not yet at the point of covering every loss. If you have fire insurance on a building that you own, more than likely that coverage will pay almost all of your loss if the building burns down, God forbid. You may have a deductible, but fire insurance knows now how to cover the whole loss. Cyber liability insurance may not cover your whole loss just because the nature of the market. It may not have the ability to cover everything that you lose. So you want to be as much of a partner in that risk management, that risk reduction as your insurer, and not just rely on the insurance company to pay if you lose anything, because it may not cover all your losses. The policies are not yet able to contemplate every type of loss, and quite frankly, they may not be able to afford it. You know, you can't have a coverage that has unlimited downside risk. You know, if you have a building that you know is worth $1 million, well, you can write coverage for $1 million. You know it's not going to cost more than that to replace the building. Cyber liability has no high-end limit on what it could lose. There could be liability for you, for clients, for customers. So they're going to put a limit on it. Even if they put a $2 million limit on your policy, you could lose $10 million in a cyber event. So in addition to having the coverage to help offset losses, you want to make sure you're doing things within your company to keep the losses from happening in the first place, or if they do, keep them within the limits of your policy. Those are the top 7 things you want to do before you start contacting agents and brokers, because by doing this, they're going to ask you for it anyways. They're going to want to see all these written policies and things you've done. And if you go over and above and beyond what they are going to require, you may get higher place coverage and better access to markets that your broker can present to you, beyond which an amateur or first-time buyer may not be able to access.